The first thing to know about the Justice Department now appealing the judge's ruling and fighting to keep this document secret, first thing to know about it is that the brief filed here, the reasoning explained by Merrick Garland's Justice Department, is humiliating. It's abject and humiliating. Throughout the brief filed with the court late last night, the Justice Department, the current Justice Department, is just crawling and scraping about how they didn't mean what they said and how sorry they are that it looked the way that the judge thought it looked, but they didn't mean it to look that way. And now, in retrospect, they can see how misleading their previous statements seemed to the court when Barr was Attorney General. But really, please, couldn't they be forgiven for all that? And I know you think I'm being hyperbolic, but look, this is the actual language from the brief that has now been filed with the court. Quote, in retrospect, the government acknowledged that its briefs could have been clearer, and it deeply regrets the confusion that caused. But the government's counsel and declarants did not intend to mislead the court. Quote, we regret the language that was imprecise in the government's brief and the confusion it has caused. Quote, we regret that we did not make this distinction clearer in our briefing. Quote, the government now recognizes that several statements in its briefing were susceptible to an interpretation. Quote, these passages could have been clearer, and the government regrets that they were not. Quote, the second and third sentences could have been worded differently to avoid confusion. Quote, with the benefit of hindsight, the government regrets that its declarations and briefs did not state expressly. I mean, this is gross. This is humiliating. This is the Justice Department now, under Merrick Garland as Attorney General, bending over backwards like this to try to make it seem like the Justice Department under Trump was acting in good faith and doing their best, and all the false and disingenuous things they told the court about former President Trump's liability to potential criminal prosecution. The false and disingenuous things they told not just the public, but the court should all be forgiven, because we're so sure that they didn't mean it to be as bad as it seems. I can see the Justice Department under Bill Barr, the Trump-era Justice Department, making these kinds of representations about themselves and their own bad behavior here. But why is the Garland Justice Department trying to make this go away, trying to clean this up? We didn't really mean it. Does it seem like we lied? We didn't mean to lie. We recognize it kind of looks like a lie, but well, look at us. We'd never lie. That's one thing to know about it. The other thing to know about it, the other thing to at least ask about all of this is, however this resolves with the Justice Department and what gets released to the public and what doesn't, and this question of why the new Attorney General is trying to paper over what Barr did to protect Trump and to try to occlude from view, even of the courts, the question of Trump's potential criminal liability. Regardless of how that all resolves, the question that's now live and kind of red hot is whether or not Trump now is liable to federal prosecution for obstruction of justice by the Justice Department, right? Whether or not he's liable for prosecution right now for the instances of alleged obstruction of justice that were laid out in the Mueller report. None of those things are so far in the past that they're outside the statute of limitations. I mean, what has become clear through all of this unequivocally is that the Barr-era Justice Department never did substantively consider obstruction charges against Trump. Despite all the evidence laid out against him, despite them lying to the public and the courts and saying they looked at that evidence very clearly, they did not. It was never looked at. We now know. The question of whether or not Trump should face federal criminal charges is no longer constrained by him being a president and a sitting president and therefore immune from prosecution. That no longer applies. And the question of potential federal prosecution of him for obstruction of justice has never been substantively looked at, despite the hundreds of detailed pages of evidence about those alleged crimes that was made public in the Mueller investigation. So, will the Garland-era Justice Department now consider those charges?